This is the Compass Podcast, where we give you a glimpse of the divine in the everyday. My name is Ryan Dunn.
My name is Pierce Drake.
Welcome back, Pierce. Did you have a good vacation?
I did, yeah. A few days celebrating our little one turning 1. You know, we held off on sugar until her birthday cake, and so that was a lot of fun. She destroyed it, as you should.
Yeah. What was that moment like? Did a veil drop from her face when she first consumed that sugar? Or
Yeah, a little bit. Funny enough, she liked the cake more than the icing.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
But yeah, there was a moment to where her hands go in the cake and she doesn't realize that's okay, and and then she realizes it's okay and then destroys this little 4-layer cake of hers. And no, but it was great, and especially in this season to finally leave our house. I mean, we've left our house for small things, but we haven't seen family in 4 months, and so just to see family and to do life together and eat good meals and be around the table together is great.
And experience sugar for the first time too. That's cool.
Yeah.
We're kind of actually talking about discovering new things in this podcast episode. We're talking with Brandon Renscher, and Brandon is a minister over in Greensboro, North Carolina. He has founded a community, a faith community, a church actually, called the Good Neighbor Movement. And they are a system of really small groups meeting together, sharing a rhythm of life together. And they're based around something called contemplative activism and building a local presence then to build a larger beloved community. So Brandon came with us to share about the background of that and what it looks like in this day and age, and especially specifically this day and age in, COVID pandemic times.
Yeah, I think what was incredible about our conversation, and if you're listening, I would love for you to kind of listen for, is this idea of intentional community with liturgy. This idea that, hey, we're going to do community together intentionally. We're going to ask some hard questions. We're going to ask hard questions of ourselves and of others, but we don't have to create those words ourselves. He kind of explains to us what the church word liturgy means and the liturgical calendar and some churchy words, but in a season of, for me specifically, and for a lot of us, I believe, where we're having struggle finding our words. And he teaches how, one, they have been doing this for a long time, so this is nothing new for them. And I think that's what's another incredible thing to listen to, is he's seasoned in this. And a lot of churches and communities are trying to figure this out now because they have to. But there's a lot to learn from him. Whether you're a pastor, a leader, you're all leaders, or church world or non-church world, faith leader, or faith person, or someone not of faith yet. There's a lot to learn in these conversations.
Yeah, and there's a cool rhythmic practice that Brandon goes through, and I invite you to stay tuned for that as well. So our talk with Brandon Renscher coming right up. So Brandon, you're with us from Greensboro, North Carolina. You have been, for the last couple of years, overseeing something called the Good Neighbor Movement. It's a really enticing name. Can you tell us, what is behind the Good Neighbor Movement? What are we talking about when we talk about Good Neighbor Movement?
Yeah, Good Neighbor Movement. We're a new church start, and we sort of officially started July 2017 when my family and I I was appointed to Greensboro to start.
They were too. I mean, they just,
That's how it works, right?
The bishop doesn't tell them, they tell you, but
That's right. That's right. I can sort of share some of the immediate story around that and then share a little bit broader after this. But the year prior to July 2017, my wife and I were just in a lot of discernment around just next steps. And we had met the district superintendent at that time, Nancy Rankin, Reverend Dr. Nancy Rankin. And I had been working with her, what we call church vitality strategists, in our annual conference. I know they have different names in different conferences. I had been working with the church vitality strategist, Maria King, on a couple workshops. We had just done some stuff in the connection around community engagement, asset-based community development, community organizing. And I was sort of coming at it from a rural church planting perspective, nonprofit perspective because my former appointment was in a dying rural white United Methodist church. We started a mission house together, or an intentional community, started a nonprofit out of that work. Church grew, whatever, right? So we were doing stuff across the conference, and I met Nancy at a training we did on community engagement through small congregations. And she said to me, I never met her. I was new to the conference. I come out of the AME Zion Church most immediately, and this was my first appointment in the United Methodist Church, prior to the neighbor movement. And she said to me, Brandon, I think you're the person we've been looking for. Which was odd to me because I'd never met her. A, B, we know that's just not the kind of system we have in terms of appointment making, and yeah, it just made me very curious. And what I discovered later was that there's a strong need for church planting in our annual conference, and what I'm discovering across the connection. What that means is that we have to be nimble and open to being creative about our systems and structures. And so that's what Dr. Rankin was talking about. They had dreamed about starting a multi-ethnic missional congregation downtown Greensboro, because downtown Greensboro for many, many years had been just in disrepair. And it had experienced a lot of revitalization over the last 5 years or so. And she just felt like, along with a group of laity and clergy, that something new needed to start. They didn't just want to start a new service at some of the first churches downtown, that something new needed to start because there were a lot of new people and a lot of new energy, just a lot of newness. And so, as it were, this group had been reading together about starting something like this. And what they discovered through the research and reading was that it's best practice to start a multiracial congregation, either with a co-pastor team that has a ethnic minority pastor, or you start it with an ethnic minority solo pastor. Yeah. And so that's what happened. We started coming down and praying and reading with the folks that had been meeting and studying and praying about starting something. And then my wife and I cast a vision to a couple that had lived with us in the mission house in the mountains of North Carolina. And yeah, they believed it. And we're like, yeah, we're going to uproot and come with you. So we all
Brandon, can you unpack that for us a little bit? Like, what is a mission house?
Mission house. Sure. So a mission house, it's called the Blackburn House. It's still going. The timeline is blurry for me now at this point, especially in the pandemic. Is there such a thing as time in a pandemic, right? But Blackburn House was an intentional community. It functioned as a service year program for young adults. And we recruited young adults, usually folks that were just graduating from the colleges right around the high country area of North Carolina, to come and spend at least a year, living in intentional community and serving in this declining rural church and declining rural community, sort of searching for their sense of call and gifts. Not all of them were seeking to be ordained or seeking to be licensed, but some were. And so we did that for 4 years while we were in the high country. And so this couple that has since moved to Greensboro with us to help us start Good Neighborhood, Kelly and Andrew are their names. Kelly lived with us in the mission house, my wife and I, my son, when we started the intentional community. And later on, Andrew became her sweetheart and was always around the intentional community and served with us, and ended up moving to the neighborhood because he was in college at the time. And so, yeah, when we got the sense of call to come to Greensboro, there are people, the way that and we'll talk more about this, I'd imagine, but the way that we see church, that it's about the people of God, it's about the community. And so we didn't want to start with just myself or just my family, or even just the people who had been sort of dreaming and praying here in Greensboro. We needed, there had to be some sense of DNA that we had began to cultivate in that place, the former appointment, around incarnational ministry, justice work, kind of all this kind of being a part of what it means to be church, to help us start this. And they said yes, which was awesome. And so they came down with us throughout 2016, 2017, and then 2017 was when I was appointed. And so that's some of the sort of immediate history around Good Neighbor Movement.
I love that story in the sense of, I think a lot of us right now, maybe more than ever, just as a broad base of people, are in a discernment season. I think the whole COVID thing has given everybody different stress and different people handle it differently, but there was an article, I don't know if you guys read it. There's an article that came out kind of like week one of like when the NBA shut down, like all that kind of stuff. Like that, to me, that's week one of like COVID and and this quarantine. And it was from a pastor. I don't remember who wrote it, but he basically said this, right? He said, are we in a blizzard? Are we in a long winter, or are we in an ice age? A blizzard, we just like hunker down for a few weeks. We struggle through online church and community, whatever. Long winter, we have to build some new structures.
That's right.
Got to live a little differently, but we're going to go back to a more normal base of life. And then the ice age, obviously, is like we change how we live completely. And so I think as we step into more of a long winter through this season, a lot of people are asking the questions. Like I still oversee middle school, high school, and college students at our church. I'm having conversations with them where they're going, listen, I'm not going to play ball in college. Like I'm not that good, but it's going to take me out of my house for 5 nights a week. I think maybe I need to just stay at home and go to school and do life with my family. And so it's like conversations I've never had with students before. All of that to say, there's an encouraging word in what you just said in the midst of, as you're discerning, you don't know who God's talking to about you.
Right.
You don't know where like we're always looking for the answer, looking for discernment, but you could just be in a meeting and sharing your own heart and somebody else say, hey, actually, that's connecting. Right. And so for so many of us that are in this discerning season, hearing you go, hey, me and my wife were discerning for a year. And then I randomly ran into this person, and that was the person that opened it up.
That's right.
I'm not a name it and claim it kind of person. That's not our theology. That's right. But I do think God puts people in our path. Just for a lot of people that are in this discerning process, I hope there's a lot of hope in that, hearing your story and how God's listening. Yeah,
absolutely. It was a very powerful time. Yeah, and even so the story within that story around discernment was that the why behind we felt the call to move in the first place is deeply connected to why Kelly and Andrew decided to join us, why Nancy felt the need or a sense of urgency for a multiracial congregation. For us, it was a couple of things. We had started at that last appointment this summer when George Zimmerman was acquitted of killing Trayvon Martin. Mm-hmm. We had moved from Chicago. We could not have anticipated that being the season that we moved to an all-white, rural, declining congregation in church. But we are deeply committed to place. And so we had lots of opportunities to sort of leave home, if you will, right, to go and be with our people on the front lines of the Black Lives Matter movement across the country. Right. We decided to bring Black Lives Matter to this small, white, rural community. And so we engaged in a lot of very meaningful work around vigils, et cetera. We were doing a lot of study within the mission house around how race and injustice shapes what it means to be a disciple. So it was very, very meaningful. And at the same time, because it was still a bit at a distance, it was happening in Ferguson and happening in, Chicago, right? It wasn't happening in North Carolina at that time, right? And then it did.
That's right.
And the Charlotte Uprising happened in 2016. And I was done. The sense of loneliness my family felt as it got that close was hard to shake. Loneliness in this sense, I want to be very nuanced and clear about this. Loneliness around a sense of solidarity, needing solidarity, and loneliness around a yearning to resist deeply the structures that make the murder of Black and brown men and women and siblings, human siblings, possible in the first place in this country. And that wasn't happening. We were doing things, but it wasn't that. So that was the why I ended up at the Highlander Center in Tennessee. Y'all are familiar with the Highlander Center, historic place. It is a sort of place where folks like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, James Lawson, our own United Methodist, he is a luminary, right? Like in terms of movement history, they back in the 60s, et cetera, trained for the Southern Black Freedom Movement at that site, at the Highlander Center. And that was really where the call came. Now I'll wrap up here. And this is the sort of why behind the story that I shared with you before. The why was a deep sense of call to reconstruct the church as the Jesus movement. That was the language that came out of that time. It was a convening of clergy activists from across the country. And we were talking about the biggest social issues of our day: Occupy Wall Street, Moral Mondays, the starting of the Poor People's Campaign. And there was a white leader that was working for an organization called Momentum. And he came to me privately and said, "Brent, I know you're jamming with what we're talking about. Appreciate that. But I feel like the bigger call in this country amongst Christians and faith leaders, but Christians in particular, is to reconstruct the Jesus movement." He said, "We need a new," he didn't say reconstruct. He said, we need a new Jesus movement in this country. And it hit me like a ton of bricks in my chest. And so that was really, really deeply the sort of the why for me, was that the flavor of what I felt in that mission house of how we did life together, that was deeply movemental, that was deeply leaderful, that was deeply about being in and with the wider community, that was multiracial, that was being led and centered by that folks that were most marginalized were leading and being centered, was like what needed to be a vision for the church for tomorrow. So, yeah.
So when you then moved on over to Greensboro and you're charged with starting this new church, quote unquote, in a kind of way, how'd you go about doing that? It doesn't sound like it was just like, hey, we're going to get a school gym and have a worship service. What went into you starting this church in Greensboro?
Yeah. The first thing was prayer. And what I mean by prayer is the tradition of praying with your feet. So we went out and we started talking to folks, asking them what about the history of this place. So we moved to a very specific neighborhood in Greensboro on the wrong side of town. Got a lot of flack about that, by the way, from the institution. But anyway, we asked people about the history of this place, asked them about the deep longings and yearnings for this place, what made their heart come alive, what made them stay up at night. That began to shape the DNA of Good Neighbor Movement. And what we discovered through those conversations was that folks wanted to experience more community, a real true sense of community. Greensboro is one of the most church cities in North Carolina. Folks didn't feel the need for another worship service. It was I knew that from all the research, but I believe deeply in listening to the witness of the people. Like, I can read a book all day, right? What do the people have to say? Not least because by listening to them, it creates an opportunity to invite people to action. And that's exactly what we did. But folks weren't really interested in the worship service. There's tons of churches all over the place that have Sunday morning worship services, and even cool versions that are on Saturday, whatever, right? Like, there's so many examples of that, and bless God for them. And we have relationships with a lot of those folks. But what folks were really yearning for was deep community. They were really yearning for a sense of taking action with their faith around their values and faith. Definitely a sense of wanting the community to look and feel like the kind of diversity that we have here in Greensboro. Greensboro, I haven't looked at the latest statistic, but when I first moved here, it was on path to be the first majority minority city in the state. So really matching the kind of 2045 trends of America, right? That there's no racial majority in it. And so like we have that in Greensboro. Yeah. So like as we began to really listen and pray, that just began to shape up things. And we came up with 4 values out of that. Those 4 values are belong, be still, become, and be bold. And those 4 values really, frankly, y'all, shapes everything we do. Mm-hmm. It is the definition of what we believe it means to be human, what it means to be a disciple, what it means to be church, what it means to be in community, what it means to do justice work. And so we seek to embody that in everything that we do.
You know, I think one of the things that I'm going to keep bringing it back to the season we're in, but one of the things we're learning is the churches that are thriving right now. There's some really large churches thriving. There's some really small churches thriving. Here's the common denominator. It's the churches that did community, like truly did community. They're the ones that are thriving in this season. And the method and the medium in which they did it is irrelevant.
Yeah.
And so for you guys that are so community based, what does church look like? What's that community look like for y'all?
Yeah, and this time the pandemic has been crazy, y'all. In this sense, prior to COVID-19, the way these small spiritually rooted activist groups are really the heartbeat and the primary organizing structure of Good Neighbor Movement. those groups take time to form. There's a quote from Adrienne Marie Brown in her book, Emergent Strategy, where she says, you move at the pace of trust. Like before the pandemic, the ability to build trust was really difficult because people's attention span was just very limited to the things that matter in the world, because of all kinds of distractions. For many people, their attention span is very limited because of the just kind of struggling to get by, like their work or just the limitations in their life just make it such that they just kind of can't. So it just takes time to build that trust. And the reason why that trust is important is not so they can trust me as a preacher, but so that we can trust each other to build community together in a neighborhood, in multiple neighborhoods across the city. So the pandemic made it such that everyone had time for the most part. The kinds of distractions that were and the kinds of necessities that folks had to hustle for before, you just couldn't when you're sheltering in place. So what that meant was a lot more opportunity for us to build trust and much more quickly. But the reason why I think that God trusted us with that is because we had done the slow work of building trust in really genuine and authentic ways. And so what that has looked like is a couple of things. First of all, we launched public worship, which was crazy in the midst of the pandemic. And our public worship, our first service, we did it on a Holy Saturday. We called it Freedom's Eve. And so it was really powerful time. Yeah, that was really incredible. We did it over, originally we wanted to do it over Zoom through Facebook Live and broadcast through Facebook Live. We had a bunch of technical issues, and we just knew that, like, because of the technical issues, we wouldn't get anybody to show up. We just had it on Zoom, and then, it was amazing to watch folks flood in on the screen. Because the thing about Facebook Live is that, like, it's hard to get a sense of community around that. And so I feel like God did that. That was a mistake, if you will, that was very God ordained in the sense that we really had always intended our public worship to be very intimate. And so being able to do it over Zoom versus on Facebook Live felt right. So that's one way. I think another way is that a lot of mutual aid work, we move intentionally to the points of pain in our city because of our emphasis on being bold and on justice. And so being able to build relationships, to build on relationships and to build new relationships around what people need and what they have to offer. So mutual aid was another way in which to build community. The other piece is that our city villages, these groups, we went completely online and we just developed some really creative ways to be together. And a lot of it has a lot to do with the arts and spiritual practice. So everything from journaling to engaging in chanting, because chanting is something that you can do and you don't got to feel like you're the best singer. And even some of the kind of delay that you get with being online, it doesn't matter because it's meant to be kind of this deep, vibrant sense of kind of being offbeat a little bit, off key. So many things like that. And the last thing I'll say is, of course, when George Floyd was murdered and the uprising started to take place, we were just already in a place where we were nimble and agile because of when COVID-19 hit. And we absolutely unleashed all of our groups to really hit the streets and protest and care for our community. In response to that, the most immediate way in which we form community is absorbing tons of new people out of that. I mean, we absorb new people out of the mutual aid and pandemic, like COVID-19 stuff as well. But the uprising was another level. And so we absorbed a ton of new people around what we called soulful learning action communities. And so that's been really cool to sort of plug people into those pathways, especially folks that are spiritually curious or explicitly Christian, looking to deepen their action for Black lives in this moment around a more radical, a more historical way of following Jesus in this moment.
What does a group like that do? A soulful learning action?
Yeah, community? Some of it is a lot of learning. So we each of the groups has a book or a text that they're grappling with.
Okay.
So, one of them is reading The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone. One is reading Octavia Butler's book, The Parable of the Sower, in conversation with Scripture. And then all of them are engaging in spiritual practices together. So everything from journaling to meditation, to centering prayer, to engaging in singing, in particular around traditions like the spirituals. And so, the idea is to sort of match match is not the right word, to sort of integrate deep spiritual, prophetic spiritual practice with the issues that we're facing in our country right now. And then, of course, lots of calls to action every week around ways in which folks can show up either online or in person with things that are happening in our city.
That's powerful, because I think like there is a nimbleness to the organization that y'all have, especially in times like these. Everything has kind of become like hyper identified through this pandemic period, right? And
that's right.
And so a nimbleness in the way that we organize as a community of faith, it really comes forward.
That's
and
right.
A lot of us, when we think about like church and we think about a rhythm of life to church, there's the big event is Sunday morning.
Yep.
Or maybe Saturday night or whatever. And then, there might be the supplemental like Wednesday night Bible study or small group meeting. And it sounds like y'all have really turned to say like our big event is, or our big point of rhythm is this small time gathering.
That's right. That's right. And multiple of them throughout the week where it makes sense for folks, where it's accessible for people. Which means that you got to have a leaderful environment, because I can't do it all. And I don't do it all. I don't do hardly any of it, actually, except for, the stuff that's mine to do that makes sense for me based on what I value, my sense of call, the people who I'm connected to that I've invited into relationship. And so, yeah, absolutely. Now, I love how you say that. What's big is the small. And so what that means is that it's not that we undervalue what we traditionally call big, because we've had several big public gatherings. I told you about Freedom's Eve. We also had a gathering cross country called the Collective Day of Grief, which was a way to mourn the loss of lives and to mourn the loss of plans and dreams, and also to mourn and lament the injustice of this moment. So in other words, to kind of lament the world that we've lost, that in many ways provides an opportunity to create something new that's better, that's more just, that's more fair. And so we had that Collective Day of Grief. We also had a second public worship service called PJP, Pride, Juneteenth, and Pentecost. And so we did that on the Sunday of Pride Month. And then we've done and so even those, we don't belittle those. Those are just as big. The point is what we bring to bear in that space are the values and the intentionality and the quality kind of experiences that we have in the small spaces.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, it's taken back to two things, at least I hear it. It's taken back, one, the Acts and how the church, we put so much of, like Ryan was saying, we're just talking about, we put so much emphasis on the Sunday gathering, but that was not the early church.
That's right.
They did life together, and it was daily breaking of bread, daily prayer, daily stuff. And one of the things that we've talked about here on the podcast before is I've loved seeing churches go back to that. Right. Pastors going, hey, I actually can get on here and do a 10-minute raw devotional at 7 a.m. and, those kind of things. And then two, it's going back to our history as Methodists with Wesley, kind of class meeting, band meetings, his whole small group sessions. I laugh about it to the fact of small groups are nothing new to the Methodists. We just forget we do them.
That's right.
And so, but yeah, his kind of, I was talking to another youth pastor the other day who just started doing kind of discipleship bands and that kind of stuff. And it's flourishing for him.
That's right.
Their ministry. Yeah, so I love the two history moments coming back to the forefront. Yeah, we're still going to do the big thing.
That's right.
But we're gonna kind of pull in even tighter. And one of the things I've loved watching is at least in our community, people are building onto their homes right now, and from the elaborate to the simple. But all it is saying we want more people in our homes. We want to create spaces. How many people have you seen build fire pits in their backyard? And
yes,
why? Because we want this to be a place that we do life together. So.
That's right. Yeah. Porch sitting. We've done a lot of porch sitting.
Right.
Yeah. It's just now is the time. It's so interesting because it's everyone's all the pastors, all my clergy colleagues and friends are trying to figure out what's after this. Basically what you're saying, Pierce, around is it the sort of long winter, the ice age, what is church going to look like after this? What does reopening look like? And it's just so interesting to me to get phone calls from lots of clergy colleagues who, like, at least for us, when we first started, like when this wasn't something, like we've been doing this, right? Like before a pandemic, before an uprising. And when I would talk about it around the city or within the connection, it just was like, I'm not going to be too judgmental here. Let's just say it wasn't their thing. Let's just put it that way. But now all the texts and, requests to like try to figure it out. And I just, like, part of me wants to say, like, this is not a fad. This is a way of life for us. And like the challenge for the church in this moment is, who do you say that I am? Right? Like, it's not what's the trendy thing to do because I've got to keep my people. It's like, who do you say that I am and who are you? Like, what kind of person do you want to be? And I think that if we can grapple with that question in light of some of the changes we're making, then I do think it can be sustainable. Otherwise, we know, like anything else, things will absolutely go back to business as usual for a lot of folks because their heart wasn't in it, because they weren't being transformed and changed. And they weren't hearing the stories and power of the spirit of transformation within people. It was really just about changing the show to something that was relevant or the new consumerist model of the time.
What does it look like for you guys in the sense of this? I mean, you guys have been doing this for a while, right? So like we said, like this isn't new for y'all, but you talked about the groups that have formed out of this. They're reading different books. They're doing different things. I personally come from a lower thought of a low model of church. I'm not a high church kind of guy. But what I have found interesting is I'm reading more books on prayer. I'm doing more lectio divina. I'm doing more liturgy because I don't have the words. And they're helping give me words to do. So how's giving words to them to process, not just saying like, hey, what do we think about this? How's that played? And what can we learn from that?
Yeah. Liturgy is so important to us, y'all. And again, it was before the pandemic, and it's even more so now. So, one of the things, like I sort of, some of my training out of sort of doing missional communities or groups, whatever, comes out of an organization called V3, Church Planting Movement. They're great folks. That's sort of their secret sauces around missional incarnational communities. And so they talk about making sure that a missional community has what they call an artifact. And an artifact is essentially what it is like a prayer book. Like it's like a tool, its own tool of how to, so it's sort of its own liturgy to be able to sort of have words. You can venture away from it, just like the lectionary, right? Or you can stay on. It just depends on the life of the community, but you need it in order for there to be a sense of connection to the tradition. And so what I didn't know when I first learned about that framing from them of the language of artifact, I like that language a lot, and I didn't realize why I liked it. But here's what I'm trying to get at. One of the things people ask me all the time, like, how do you keep up with all these groups? I don't, first of all. And one of the ways that we had to learn really early is that I couldn't keep up. And this is where the liturgy is hugely helpful, is that we don't have to invent new things necessarily.
Right.
We might give it we might adapt it or relate it to our values, to our system, our mission, to who we are as a community, right? But the liturgy has been really, really important. So this is where lectio liberatio comes in. Every time our groups gather, that's what they gather around. They gather around the lectionary, right? And this practice that we formed, that's a remix of lectio divina. And the reason for the remix is because of our values, like who we are, right?
Explain, and I should have done that, explain what the lectionary is and kind of what this process is for y'all.
Yeah, the lectionary. Ooh, the lectionary.
Sounds like a really tricky word.
Yeah, it's just a way to read the scripture that the church has conferred, bequeathed to us over the ages, so that we can make sure we're reading across the scripture and reading through the lens of Christ and the gospel, and not in sort of piecemeal, random, sort of disjointed kinds of ways. And so there are readings daily, right? And there are also readings by the Sunday, and it matches what is called the liturgical year, these high holy days that have been observed since the beginning. So for us, in the lectio liberatio, another way to say that is liberation reading. And so it's a way to read the scripture, to read the liturgical tradition through the lens of our lineage, in particular as people of color and Black folks in this country, which is always a very dynamic wrestling with scripture, searching for the living word. It's very conversational. There may be a short piece where I write something, or in the city village I'm a part of that I share, but the idea is to move us into this conversation around these four movements. We use our values to sort of name these four movements. And so, we always start with, we always start with the question, belong. It's usually the first one that we start with. And the question we ask is, what is the conflict and or change in the text, and who or what in the text connects to the story of your family and community of origin? Yeah, it's just really important that the scripture not be something that's like doctrine alone or something out here, but really like, how do you place and locate yourself in this story? And again, not in a way that is doing injustice to the story, but a way that really honors the story by saying, like, what is happening here? What's the challenge in this text? The next movement is be bold. What policies and cultural norms is the text resisting or calling us to resist? Again, really kind of wrestling with, like, how can we live this out? Let's not just have a conversation that's like sort of, gosh, I wish I could say what I want to say. That's sort of theological meandering,
Yeah.
And then become what vision of healing and liberation does the text call forth? Again, sort of moving us into not just what's wrong, but like, what is the new creation that God is birthing through the text and through us in this place? And then be still. What is the text calling you? So the person reading, you to pay attention to in yourself. This is not just about externalizing about what's wrong out there. It's about how do the principalities and powers, how is Satan wreaking havoc in your own heart and soul? And how can you do, what is it that you have to do within your own soul to be in service to that vision of liberation and healing that we see God calling forth for this people that we're reading about in the text, but also for our moment. It's a powerful way to engage scripture. We never make it through all four in one setting, which is wonderful.
Okay.
Which is wonderful, because if the problem that I just named y'all is that like what's the content? What are we going to focus on? We always have something to focus on every time, even if it's picking up on where we left off the last week or the last 2 weeks on a text. So it's really powerful.
There's a cool paradox there in this idea of like contemplative action. Because a lot of us, when we think about contemplative practice, it's inactive, right?
That's right.
It is something where we're stationary and we're thoughtful and we're introspective. And a lot of times it just leads to, in fact, more rumination. And it sounds like what you've developed is that it leads to rumination, but in something that pushes towards action. Like liberate itself is an active word.
Yeah, absolutely. Like most of what or at least let me say it this way, the sort of popular understanding of contemplation is absolutely that you go into a cave somewhere. It's just sort of you and Jesus kind of thing.
Yeah, you and yourself.
The deal.
Yeah.
It's just not true to the history. It's just not true to the history of contemplation in its fullness. And especially if we're talking about contemplation amongst those who have been on the underside of history. And so for me, someone has not reached a sense of contemplation or is not contemplating if you don't grapple with pain and suffering. Because if you touch the point of pain and suffering, you will act. If you don't, then actually all you've done is numb and conceal, and you use theology and spiritual language to cover over that. So there's my son broke his leg during the pandemic, for example. Here's the preacher coming out of me. You got to have illustration, right? My son broke his foot, and I was like his foot since we've been in the pandemic. This is just a couple weeks ago. And what would it have looked like for me to look at my son and say, what is God calling you to in this moment? What do you think about God in the midst of, right? He's like, get me a cast, right? He didn't literally say that. He's 4. But the point is, like,
saying something, I'm sure. Yeah.
He was saying something. He got in touch with the pain of it, right?
Yeah.
Now, that's an extreme example. And it's not so extreme. Part of what I feel like this pandemic has done and the uprising has done is this, like we have been forced to not look away from our own sickness in the church right?
Yeah.
Our attachment to domination, our attachment to things and money and power, right? And in the world, same thing. And so because of that, what we have an invitation to do is to really feel that sickness so that we can, that's contemplation, right? Like, what does it look like to go interior, to go inside?
Yeah, the difference there is like there's a difference in asking Jesus for healing and asking Jesus to walk in the pain with you.
That's right.
There's a difference in going, hey, I need this healed, I need this fixed, or hey, I'm actually asking you just to enter it. Like enter it and walk in with me. And really to receive true healing is gonna cause more pain in the beginning.
That's
Like if
right.
we have real problems, the doctor actually has to cut us open. It's got to cause some new wounds to get to deeper
That's right.
healing.
And like I'm gonna keep going with that metaphor. I love that, Pierce. Like a lot of us don't often know where we're hurting or what the hurt is caused, what the hurt is caused by. And oftentimes, even if we want to keep going with the sort of medical sort of field, oftentimes, right, like what we're learning in contemporary sort of medical science, that like often, right, like doctors really depend on what we tell them, right, around where the pain is. Well, if we don't know, how many cuts we gonna get till we get to the problem? So part of what I'm saying contemplation, contemplative activism does, again, within the lineage that I come from, right, is that you go interior to really search for where the pain is, right? By doing that, it's going to connect you deeply to your own story, connect you deeply to those times where you have been harmed, to those times where you have caused harm. It's going to be a face attached to that, faces attached to it. There's going to be places attached to it, right? There's going to be words attached to it. And then what happens is you can't not look away. You can't look away, If you touch that kind of pain in your life, to look away from that and to not do something about it is what, maybe is what the scripture is talking about when it's talking about having a reprobate heart or reprobate mind. You know what I mean? Like, so I say all that to say, just to conclude, contemplative activism is going interior deep enough in community, because if you're going to touch that kind of pain, you need support.
Right.
Because that's hard to do. To name, okay, you can say all day, there are these isms out in the world, but where did it show up in your life? How did your family and your churches and your schools choose to act in this way? And how were you a part of that? That's right. You gonna need some support.
I think it's going into that, like, it's not worth, at least for me, it's not worth going that deep to hit that pain level unless I know what's at the core. And at the core for us is the Imago Dei, is the image of God. That's the core. And so all this stuff, whether it was put on us or we put it on ourselves or however it got there, I'm not willing to go, and this is kind of where my faith steps in, I'm not willing to do that hard work, if I'm honest, unless I know what it is I'm going after. And I'm going after the image of God at the core of who I am. And that for that to be birthed out. So a lot of cutting, all that community, I need all that, but I need to know where I'm headed. And we're all headed there together. Like we're all headed to the Imago Dei together. There's hope.
And we come out on the other side different, right? Because like even if you have faith in the, even if you absolutely, I mean you will, right? Like if you get that deep around the pain, right? And then you begin to do the work around dismantling or resisting or exercising, to use some more theological language, exercising those demons, right? From that point of pain, you're going to be different on the other side. And so there's a real risk around that. It does involve faith. I appreciate you bringing that up, Pierce. And here's where the evangelist and apostolic leader in me really, really feels like this is where the church has something unique to offer in the world. Because here's where, you go into other sectors, they don't have what you just named, Pierce, but we do have a tradition and we have language and we have practices. We have the gifts of grace to really hold that kind of investigation, that kind of interior searching. And so it's a really I feel a sense of responsibility to be out on the front lines of the most challenging questions and problems that we have in our world. because people are searching for how they can go about searching for authenticity in a way that they don't obliterate, or that they're not going to fall into the kind of hopelessness and despair that like is not going to help them at all. It's going to make them a sort of traditional contemplative in that sense, right? I don't even want to call it traditional, a popular contemplative in that sense. Like, and we have that. And so like, I appreciate you naming that, Piers. That's huge. We have that to offer. And that's a lot of what those soulful action learning communities, a lot of what we're doing is providing people these practices collectively. It's just like anything else when you have to try something on. Doing it together makes it feel like you can do it in a way that when it's time to do it on your own in solitude, you feel more confident. Because if you mess up or if it goes weird, you can go back and ask, well, how was this for you when you do it, right? So yeah, I appreciate you naming that.
Brandon, thank you so much for your time, for dropping all that knowledge with us today.
Yeah, fun time. Thank y'all so much for being in the conversation. This is great.
So thanks so much for joining us. Hey, if this was meaningful for you, do us a huge favor and drop a rating and review on your platform podcasts of choice, whether that be like Apple Podcasts or something else. That's how more people get turned on to podcasts. And we would appreciate you spreading the word about the Compass podcast as well. Piers, for folks who want to get in touch with you, where's a good spot?
Yeah, Instagram and Twitter are where I'm living these days, and that is JPDII.
Cool. And I'm Ryan Dunn. I'm behind the Rethink Church social media accounts. So go ahead and search out Rethink Church. We're probably going to be the first thing that comes up on any social media platform. I'd be happy to converse with you there. And you can check out more episodes of the Compass podcast over at umc.org/podcasts. Thanks so much. Peace to you.